The fiery embers from the burning saloon danced in Tabitha Jameson's dark eyes as she stood frozen in horror. Her silk dress clinging to her skin in the stifling summer heat of 1878. She had never imagined her return to Sheridan. Wyoming would end like this, with everything she'd worked for reduced to ash and flame. Flynn Valero had been riding for 3 days straight when he spotted the smoke billowing over the horizon. At 32, he'd seen enough trouble to know when to ride away and when to ride toward it. Something pulled him forward this time, his horse's hooves pounding against the hard, packed earth as he urged the animal faster toward the growing cloud of black smoke in the distance. Tabitha's lungs burned as she tried to salvage what little remained in the saloon's office. The ledger contained everything: proof of ownership, accounts, and the savings she'd managed to scrape together since her father's passing 6 months ago. Without it, she had nothing. The dress her mother had sewn for her 19th birthday last spring was already singed at the edges as she pushed deeper into the smoke-filled room. "Is anybody in here?" A deep voice called out through the crackling flames. Tabitha spun around, the ledger clutched to her chest, but found her path blocked by a fallen beam. The heat intensified as flames licked at her dress, the delicate fabric catching quickly. "Help!" she screamed, frantically trying to pat out the flames climbing up her skirt. A tall figure emerged through the smoke, bandana pulled up over his nose, hat low over his eyes. Without hesitation, the stranger lunged forward, ripping off his duster and wrapping it around her smoldering dress. "Hold tight," he commanded, sweeping her up into his arms in a single fluid motion. The ledger remained clutched in her white-knuckled grip as the cowboy ran through the smoke, navigating the burning debris with surprising agility. They burst through the back door into the alley, the fresh air hitting Tabitha's lungs like a physical blow. She coughed violently as the stranger set her down a safe distance from the building, his strong hand steadying her shoulders. "You all right, miss?" he asked, pulling down his bandana to reveal a strong jaw darkened with several days' growth of beard. "My saloon," she managed between coughs. "Everything I have is in there." Flynn looked back at the burning building, the flames now consuming the entire structure. The bucket brigade had formed too late. There would be nothing left to save. "Nothing in there is worth your life," he said firmly, his blue eyes meeting hers for the first time. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of sorts, though they'd never met before. Tabitha clutched the ledger tighter and straightened her spine. "This was," she said, holding up the leather-bound book. "And I thank you for helping me keep it." Flynn Valero hadn't planned on staying in Sheridan more than a night, just long enough to resupply before continuing north to Montana Territory. Now, looking at the determined young woman with soot-streaked cheeks and singed hair, he found himself reconsidering. "Flynn Valero," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Seems like you might need some help." "Tabitha Jameson," she replied, taking his hand briefly. "And Mr. Valero, you have no idea." The town of Sheridan had grown considerably in the 3 years since Tabitha had left for finishing school back east. What had once been a small trading post along the Bozeman Trail had evolved into a proper frontier town with the railroad's arrival. Her father's saloon, now hers, had been one of the first businesses established, and until today, one of the most successful. As the crowd worked to prevent the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings, Tabitha stood silently watching the flames consume her inheritance. Flynn remained beside her, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Mrs. Hollister takes in boarders," she replied, not taking her eyes off the inferno. "I was staying there until I could move into the rooms above the saloon." Flynn nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered. Something about the fire didn't sit right with him. It had spread too quickly, burned too hot for an accidental blaze. This fire was anyone inside when it started. Tabitha finally turned to look at him, her expression sharpening. Just me. I'd closed early to go through the accounts. She hesitated. Why do you ask? No reason, he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just curious. Sheriff Mills approached them, hat in hand, his gray mustache drooping with sweat from the heat. Miss Jameson, terrible tragedy. Your daddy would be heartbroken to see this. Yes, she agreed, her voice steady despite the emotion Flynn could see swimming in her eyes. But we can rebuild. That's the spirit, Mills said, though his expression remained grim. Though I should mention there's been talk in town. Some folks weren't pleased about a young, unmarried woman running a saloon. Not proper, they said. Is that so? Tabitha's back stiffened. And who exactly had concerns about propriety while happily drinking my whiskey? The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Just passing along what I've heard. No need to get upset. I think Miss Jameson has every right to be upset, Flynn interjected, his voice casual but his eyes hard. Her property just burned to the ground. Sheriff Mills eyed Flynn with suspicion. Don't believe we've met, stranger. Flynn Valero, just passing through. Well, Mr. Valero, I appreciate you helping Miss Jameson, but we can handle matters from here. Tabitha stepped forward. Mr. Valero saved my life, Sheriff. I'd say he's earned the right to speak his mind. The older man's face reddened slightly, but he nodded curtly. As you wish. I'll be looking into the cause of the fire. Might want to check that stove of yours could have overheated. As the sheriff walked away, Flynn turned to Tabitha. The stove wasn't lit, was it? She shook her head slowly. No, it's summer. We haven't used it in months. Their eyes met again, understanding passing between them. Someone had set the fire deliberately, and both of them knew it. Mrs. Hollister's boarding house sat on the eastern edge of town. A 2-story white clapboard building with a well-tended garden and strict rules about gentlemen callers. Flynn escorted Tabitha to the front porch, maintaining a respectful distance as befitted a lady of her standing. You should be safe here, he said, scanning the street with watchful eyes. I'll find a room at the hotel and check on you tomorrow. Tabitha clutched her salvaged ledger, her expression a mix of gratitude and wariness. Mr. Valero, I appreciate your concern, but you don't need to involve yourself in my troubles. You said yourself you're just passing through. Flynn touched the brim of his hat. Plans change, Miss Jameson. Besides, I'm curious now, curious. About who'd want to burn down your saloon and whether they intended you to be inside when it happened. A chill ran down Tabitha's spine despite the summer heat. She hadn't allowed herself to consider that possibility. Good evening, Mr. Valero, she said quietly. And thank you again. As Flynn walked toward the hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just entangled himself in something complicated. He'd spent the years since the war avoiding complications, drifting from ranch to ranch, town to town. Yet something about Tabitha Jameson's determined eyes and the obvious injustice of her situation had hooked him, much like a fish on a line. The Western Star Hotel was a 3-story building that dominated Sheridan's Main Street. Flynn secured a room with a window overlooking the still smoldering remains of the saloon. After washing away the soot and smoke, he made his way to the hotel's restaurant, ordering a steak and coffee while listening to the conversations around him. Shame about the Jameson girl, an older man was saying to his companion. Thomas was a good man, but leaving that business to his daughter was asking for trouble. Heard Reynolds offered to buy her out last month, his friend replied. She turned him down flat, proud like her daddy. Flynn sipped his coffee, keeping his expression neutral as he absorbed the information. Daniel Reynolds was a name he'd encountered before, a cattle baron with holdings across Wyoming territory, known for expanding his empire by any means necessary. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the mountain air washing away the lingering smell of smoke. Flynn found Tabitha already at the burned-out saloon, picking through the charred remains. She wore a simple dark blue dress, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical knot. "Good morning, Miss Jameson," he called, approaching slowly to avoid startling her. She looked up, a small smile breaking through her serious expression. "Mr. Valero, I didn't expect to see you so early. Thought you might need an extra pair of hands," he replied, gesturing at the debris. "Anything worth salvaging. The safe survived," she said, pointing to the heavy iron box partially buried under ash. "If we can get it open, there should be enough money to make a start on rebuilding." Flynn examined the safe, noting that while scorched, the lock mechanism seemed intact. "I might be able to help with that. Used to work with a locksmith in Kansas City for a spell." Tabitha's eyebrows rose. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Valero." "Flynn," he corrected. "If we're going to be digging through ashes together, we might as well use our Christian names." "Tabitha, then," she agreed, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Though I'm not sure why you're so eager to help a stranger." Flynn crouched beside the safe, testing the mechanism. "Let's just say I recognize trouble when I see it. And I've never been good at walking away from folks in trouble." As the morning progressed, they worked side by side, salvaging what they could from the ruins. Flynn managed to open the safe, revealing a modest sum of money and several important documents, including the deed to the property. "My father bought this land outright," Tabitha explained as they sat on a bench across the street, taking a break from their labors. "No mortgage, no loans. It's one of the reasons I was able to keep the business after he passed." "And one of the reasons someone might want to drive you out," Flynn observed. "Prime location, right in the heart of town." Tabitha nodded, her eyes distant. "Daniel Reynolds made an offer last month. Said a saloon wasn't a fitting establishment for the town's future. He wants to build a bank." "Reynolds," Flynn repeated, the name confirming his suspicions. "I've heard of him. Powerful man." "Yes," she agreed, "though my father always said his power came more from fear than respect." She turned to face Flynn directly. "What about you? You said you're passing through, but you haven't mentioned where you're headed." Flynn hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing his history. "North. I've been offered work on a ranch near Billings. And before that, here and there," he said with a shrug. "Texas originally, then the war. After that, I just kept moving." Tabitha studied him with those penetrating dark eyes, running to something or away from it. A smile tugged at Flynn's lips. "Bit of both, I suppose." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a well-dressed man flanked by two rough-looking cowboys. Even before Tabitha tensed beside him, Flynn knew this must be Daniel Reynolds. "Miss Jameson," the man said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "What a terrible tragedy. I was just saying to Sheriff Mills how fortunate it is that you weren't seriously injured." Tabitha stood, her spine straight as a ramrod. "Mr. Reynolds, how kind of you to concern yourself with my welfare." Reynolds was in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were expensive but practical, marking him as a man who'd made his fortune on the frontier rather than inheriting it. "I've come to renew my offer," he said, gesturing toward the burned ruins. "Given the circumstances, I'm willing to pay the same price we discussed last month. Save you the trouble of rebuilding." Flynn rose to stand beside Tabitha, noting how the two cowboys tensed at his movement. Both were armed, their hands hovering near their holsters. "That's very generous," Tabitha replied coolly, But as I told you then, the property isn't for sale." Reynolds's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you're in shock, my dear. Perhaps in a few days, when you've had time to consider your position, you'll see things differently." His gaze shifted to Flynn. "And who might this be?" "Flynn Valero," he answered before Tabitha could speak. "I'm helping Miss Jameson assess the damage." "I see," Reynolds said, his tone suggesting he saw quite a bit more. "Well, Mr. Valero, you should know that Sheridan is a peaceful town. We don't much care for troublemakers." Flynn smiled pleasantly. "Good to hear. I've never been fond of them myself." The tension crackled between them until Reynolds finally turned back to Tabitha. "My offer stands until the end of the week. After that, I'm afraid the price will have to reflect the cost of clearing this eyesore from our main street." As Reynolds and his men walked away, Tabitha released a shaky breath. "Well, now you've met the most powerful man in Sheridan." "Charming fellow," Flynn remarked dryly. "I'm starting to think I arrived in town at exactly the right time." Tabitha looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Or exactly the wrong time. Reynolds doesn't forgive those who stand against him." "I've faced worse," Flynn said simply. "Now, let's see about getting you set up somewhere temporary while we figure out next steps." By midday, they had arranged for the town's carpenter to assess what would be needed to rebuild. To Flynn's surprise, several townspeople stopped by to offer assistance or words of encouragement to Tabitha. "Seems you have more friends than enemies," he observed as Mrs. Peterson from the bakery delivered a basket of fresh bread and promised to organize a collection to help with rebuilding costs. "My father was well respected," Tabitha explained. "And I've tried to run the saloon as he did fair prices, no cheating at cards and no trouble allowed." "Still," Flynn said, "running a business like that can't have been easy for a young woman on her own." A shadow crossed Tabitha's face. "It hasn't been. When I first returned from back east after Father's telegram about his illness, some folks were scandalized that I intended to take over rather than sell. But this place was everything to him. I couldn't just let it go." Flynn found himself admiring her determination even more. "Your father taught you the business, since I was old enough to count cards," she said with a small smile. "Mother died when I was 12 and Father raised me himself. He sent me east for schooling when I was 16, hoping I'd find a suitable husband and settle into a proper lady's life. But that wasn't the life you wanted. I was making my peace with it," she admitted. "Until Father fell ill. I came home immediately, and by then it was clear he wouldn't recover. His last wish was that I'd keep the frontier alive." "The frontier," that was the saloon's name. Tabitha nodded, gazing at the charred remains. "Named for what this place represented, a new beginning, a fresh start." Flynn understood that sentiment all too well. The war had left him adrift, searching for something he couldn't quite name. For a time, he'd thought distance would provide the answer, but after 10 years of wandering, he was beginning to doubt. "We'll rebuild it," he found himself saying. "Better than before." Tabitha looked at him sharply. "We." Flynn hadn't meant to commit himself so thoroughly, but now that he'd spoken, he realized he meant it. "I've got experience in construction. Helped rebuild half of Abilene after a tornado some years back." "Why would you do that for someone you just met?" she asked, her voice softening. Flynn considered his answer carefully. "Let's just say I recognize injustice when I see it, and I've spent too much time riding away from things I should have stayed to fight for." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, Tabitha nodded. "All right then. Partners at least until we get the frontier back on its feet." Flynn's smile came easier than it had in years. Partners. The next few days fell into a rhythm as they cleared debris and formulated plans for rebuilding. Flynn sent telegrams to contacts in neighboring towns, arranging for lumber and supplies to be delivered. Tabitha worked with the town lawyer to file insurance claims and secure the necessary permits for reconstruction. Word spread quickly about the partnership between Miss Jameson and the mysterious Mr. Valero. Some townsfolk approved, seeing it as a practical arrangement. Others whispered about impropriety, though these voices were mostly silenced when Reverend Collins himself expressed support for the rebuilding effort. Flynn took a room at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, 3 doors down the hall from Tabitha's. The arrangement satisfied the requirements of propriety while allowing them to coordinate their efforts efficiently. Each evening, they would sit on the boarding house's back porch, reviewing the day's progress and planning for tomorrow. It was during these quiet moments, with the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky, that Flynn found himself most at ease in Tabitha's company. "Tell me about Texas," she said one evening, a week after the fire. "What was it like growing up there?" Flynn leaned back in his chair, memories washing over him. "Big, wild, beautiful in its own way. My father ran cattle on land that stretched farther than you could ride in a day. Your family's still there," he shook his head. "Parents died in a fever outbreak when I was 14. Older brother took over the ranch, but we never saw eye to eye. I left at 17, just before the war started. To join the fight, eventually," he acknowledged. "Worked my way north first, tried my hand at different trades. When the fighting started, I enlisted with a Missouri regiment." Tabitha studied him in the fading light. "Union side," Flynn nodded, knowing the question carried weight even all these years later. "Yes, never owned slaves, never saw the sense in fighting to preserve something I found abhorrent. That can't have made you popular back home." "No," he agreed, his voice quiet. "My brother disowned me, haven't been back to Texas since." Tabitha's hand rested briefly on his forearm, the touch sending an unexpected warmth through him. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," he said, though the pain had never fully faded. "What about you? You mentioned finishing school, but not much else about your time back east." A complicated expression crossed her face. "Boston was educational, though not always in the ways my teachers intended. I learned to speak properly, to dance, to manage a household, all the things a proper lady should know. But," she smiled wryly, "but I also learned that I didn't belong in that world. The girls there were kind enough, but their concerns seemed so trivial compared to life here. They worried about the cut of their dresses, while I remembered winters when we weren't sure we'd have enough food to last until spring." Flynn understood perfectly. He'd encountered similar disconnects in his travels, people whose lives were so sheltered they couldn't comprehend the realities of the frontier. "Did you leave anyone special behind?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could reconsider. Tabitha looked away, her profile silhouetted against the sunset. "There was someone, a professor's son. He proposed before I left to return to father." Flynn felt an unexpected twinge of jealousy. "And you turned him down?" "I did," she confirmed. "Thomas was a good man, educated and kind. But he wanted a wife who would host dinner parties and bear children, and never concern herself with anything more substantial than household accounts." "Not the life for Tabitha Jameson," Flynn observed. She laughed softly. "No, though sometimes I wonder if I was foolish to reject such security." "Security without freedom isn't much of a bargain," Flynn said. "At least, that's how I've always seen it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Mills, his expression grave as he approached the porch. "Evening, Miss Jameson, Mr. Valero," he greeted them, hat in hand. "Hate to disturb you, but I thought you should know we've determined the cause of the fire." Tabitha straightened. "And arson, no doubt about it," Mills confirmed. Found evidence of coal oil splashed around the back entrance. Someone wanted that place to burn and burn quick. Any idea who? Flynn asked, though he already suspected the answer. Mills shifted uncomfortably. Nothing definitive, but one of Reynolds's men, fellow named Brock, was seen near the saloon shortly before the fire started. And will you be questioning this Brock? Tabitha pressed. The sheriff's hesitation told them everything they needed to know. I'll look into it, of course, but without witnesses. You mean without witnesses willing to testify against Reynolds, Flynn corrected. Mills didn't deny it. This town depends on Reynolds's cattle business. Most folks here owe him in one way or another. But not everyone, Tabitha said firmly. Thank you for telling us, Sheriff. I appreciate your honesty, if not your courage. The older man flushed but didn't argue. Just be careful, both of you. Reynolds isn't a man who gives up easily when he wants something. After Mills departed, Tabitha and Flynn sat in contemplative silence, the implications of the sheriff's visit hanging between them. We should consider accepting his offer, Flynn finally said. Tabitha stared at him in disbelief. What, after what we just heard? He burned down my property, Flynn. I know, he said quietly. Which means he won't stop there. Next time he might not be content with destroying a building. So we should just surrender, let him win. Her eyes flashed with indignation. I never took you for a coward, Flynn Valero. The accusation stung, but Flynn kept his voice even. It's not cowardice to recognize when you're outmatched. Reynolds has money, power, and men willing to do his dirty work. And what do we have? Flynn met her challenging gaze. Each other. And maybe that's enough. But I needed to be sure you understand the risk we're taking by standing against him. Tabitha's expression softened. I understand the risk. I've understood it since the day my father died and I decided to stay and run the saloon myself. This town has its share of good people, Flynn. They deserve a place that isn't controlled by Daniel Reynolds. Something shifted in Flynn's chest as he looked at her determination, her courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminded him of values he'd once fought for, ideals he'd begun to think were lost to him. All right then, he said, a new resolve firming in his voice. We rebuild, and we find a way to prove Reynolds was behind the fire. The next day brought unexpected support. Word of the sheriff's findings had spread through town, and several business owners approached Tabitha and Flynn with offers of help. Mr. Henderson from the general store extended credit for building supplies. Mrs. Peterson organized a baking sale to raise funds. Even the town's banker, Mr. Franklin, offered a modest loan at favorable terms. Seems Reynolds isn't as universally beloved as he believes, Flynn observed as they reviewed the outpouring of assistance. People are tired of living under his thumb, Tabitha agreed. They just needed someone willing to take a stand first. As they walked back toward the construction site where workers had begun laying the new foundation, a young boy ran up to them, breathless with excitement. Miss Jameson, Mr. Valero, there's a train coming in with your lumber. Flynn checked his pocket watch, frowning. It's not due until tomorrow. Well, it's coming today, the boy insisted. Mr. Peterson at the telegraph office said to tell you special delivery coming in an hour. They hurried to the train station, arriving just as the locomotive pulled in, billowing steam and smoke. Flynn had arranged for lumber to be shipped from a sawmill in Montana, but this delivery was ahead of schedule. As they approached the cargo car, a familiar figure stepped down from the train, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gray-streaked beard and a weathered face. "McCready," Flynn said in surprise, extending his hand to the older man. "Didn't expect you to deliver personally." Sean McCready, owner of the largest sawmill in Montana Territory, gripped Flynn's hand firmly. When I got your telegram about rebuilding after a fire, I figured it was time I repaid that debt from 72. Flynn turned to Tabitha. Sean and I served together. Later, I helped him establish his mill when no one would loan him the money to start. No banks would loan to an Irishman with no collateral, McCready explained with a wink to Tabitha. This fellow not only provided the funds but worked alongside me for 6 months until we turned a profit. Tabitha looked at Flynn with new appreciation. You didn't mention you were a lumber baron as well as a cowboy. Flynn shrugged uncomfortably. I'm no baron, just made a good investment in a friend. Best investment anyone ever made, McCready declared. Now, I've brought not just the lumber you ordered but a crew of 6 men, all experienced builders. We'll have your saloon up in half the time you planned. The unexpected reinforcements changed everything. With McCready's crew working alongside the local men Flynn had hired, the new frontier saloon began to take shape rapidly. The building would be larger than the original, with wider windows and a more imposing facade. I've been thinking, Tabitha said one afternoon as they inspected the progress. We should add rooms for travelers above the saloon, a proper hotel section, not just a few rental rooms. Flynn considered the idea. Competing with the Western Star, you mean? Complimenting it, she corrected. Their rooms are expensive, aimed at wealthy travelers. Ours could serve ordinary folks passing through cowboys, miners, families moving west. Smart, Flynn acknowledged. Diversifies the business, makes it more than just a drinking establishment. Exactly. Her eyes shone with excitement as she outlined her vision. We could offer meals too simple fare at fair prices. My mother taught me to cook before she passed, and I've kept up the skill. Flynn found himself captivated not just by her ideas but by her animation as she shared them. In these moments, Tabitha seemed to glow from within, her natural vibrancy breaking through the careful composure she typically maintained. We'll need to adjust the plans, he said, already mentally calculating the additional lumber and labor required. But McCready's crew can handle it. As they discussed the modifications, Daniel Reynolds rode up to the construction site, accompanied by 3 of his men, including a burly, scarred cowboy whom Flynn guessed must be Brock, the suspected arsonist. Quite an operation you've got here, Reynolds called out, his tone falsely jovial. I'm impressed by your determination, Miss Jameson. Tabitha acknowledged him with a cool nod. Mr. Reynolds, as you can see, we're well on our way to reopening. So I see. His gaze swept over the half-built structure and the busy workers. Though I wonder if you've considered the risk you're taking investing so much in an enterprise that's already proven combustible. The threat was thinly veiled, and Flynn stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Tabitha. Fortunate we've taken extra precautions this time. McCready here has experience with fireproofing techniques from back east. McCready moved to stand beside them, his size and the presence of his crew creating a visible deterrent. Reynolds's men shifted uneasily, clearly not expecting such numbers. I don't believe we've met, Reynolds said to McCready, reassessing the situation. Sean McCready, lumber and construction out of Montana. The Irishman's voice was pleasant but firm. Flynn, here's an old friend. When I heard about the unfortunate fire, I brought my best men down to help. Reynolds's smile tightened. How neighborly. Well, I won't keep you from your work. He tipped his hat to Tabitha. My offer remains open until the end of the week, Miss Jameson. I suggest you consider it carefully. As Reynolds and his men rode away, Tabitha released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He's worried. As he should be, McCready said. Nothing gets under a bully's skin like seeing his victims stand tall. Flynn watched the retreating figures thoughtfully. He'll try something else. The question is what and when. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. That evening, as they gathered for dinner at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, Sheriff Mills arrived with troubling news. "The bank's calling in loans across town," he announced without preamble. "Anyone who's offered you help or supplies, they're being pressured to withdraw support." "Reynolds," Tabitha said, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Mills nodded grimly. "He sits on the bank's board. Franklin tried to resist, but he was outvoted." "So that's his play," Flynn murmured. "Isolate us, cut off our supplies and support." "It's already working," Mills confirmed. "Henderson at the general store sent word he can't extend credit after all. Too risky for his business, he says." Tabitha set down her fork, her appetite gone. "This isn't just about my saloon anymore. He's punishing the entire town for helping us." "That's how men like Reynolds operate," McCready said, his expression dark. "I've seen it before. They control through fear because they can't earn respect." Flynn pushed back from the table, his mind racing through options. "The materials we have will be enough to complete the basic structure. We'll need to simplify the plans, focus on getting open as quickly as possible." "And then?" Tabitha asked. "And then we bring in business enough to repay our debts and establish ourselves as essential to the town," Flynn replied. "Reynolds controls through economic pressure. We need to create our own economic leverage." Late that night, unable to sleep, Flynn found himself on the boarding house porch again. The moon hung low over the mountains, casting silver light across the quiet town. He heard the door open behind him and knew without turning that it was Tabitha. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. "Too much on my mind," he admitted as she sat beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the crickets providing a gentle background chorus. "Why did you really stay, Flynn?" Tabitha finally asked. "You could have continued north, taken that ranch job you mentioned. Instead, you're risking everything for a saloon that isn't yours and a town you have no ties to." Flynn considered deflecting the question with a joke or a half-truth, as had been his habit for years when people got too close. But something about the stillness of the night and the woman beside him demanded honesty. "After the war, I couldn't settle anywhere," he began, his voice low. "Kept thinking the next town, the next job would be the one where things made sense again, but it never happened." "What were you looking for? Purpose, I suppose." He turned to look at her, her face ethereal in the moonlight. "When I rode into Sheridan and saw your saloon burning, saw you standing there refusing to give up even as everything crumbled around you, something clicked into place." "And what was that?" Flynn smiled ruefully. "The realization that I'd spent 10 years running from fights because I was tired of fighting, only to discover that the right fight can bring you back to life." Tabitha's hand found his in the darkness, her touch warm and sure. "I'm glad you found your fight here, Flynn Valero." "So am I," he whispered, his fingers tightening around hers. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings that had grown steadily since their first meeting. Flynn found himself leaning closer, drawn by something more powerful than conscious thought. Tabitha met him halfway, her lips soft against his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing faster, the connection between them irrevocably altered. "I shouldn't have done that," Flynn said, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. "Your reputation, my reputation, was in tatters the moment I decided to run a saloon on my own," she interrupted with a small laugh. "And I find I care less about what others think with each passing day." Flynn brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "Still, we should be discreet. There's enough working against us without adding scandal to the mix." Tabitha nodded reluctantly. "You're right, of course, but Flynn." She met his gaze directly. "I don't regret it." "Neither do I," he assured her. "Not for a moment." The next morning brought new challenges. Several of the local workers failed to show up at the construction site, clearly intimidated by Reynolds's pressure tactics. McCready's crew continued steadily, but progress would be slower without the additional hands. "We'll manage," Flynn assured Tabitha as they surveyed the diminished workforce. "Quality over quantity." By midday, a new complication arose. A wagon pulled up carrying Reverend Collins, accompanied by several members of the church council, all looking grave. "Miss Jameson," the Reverend began, his tone apologetic, "we've come to discuss a matter of concern to the congregation." Tabitha straightened her shoulders, already anticipating what was coming. "Of course, Reverend, how can I help?" "There have been observations regarding your close working relationship with Mr. Valero." The older man cleared his throat uncomfortably. "While we understand the practical necessities of your situation, the appearance of impropriety is entirely in the minds of gossips." Tabitha finished for him, her tone polite but firm. "Mr. Valero has been a perfect gentleman, and our business partnership has been conducted with complete propriety." One of the council members, Mrs. Whitaker, stepped forward. "It's not just about appearances, dear. It's about your safety and reputation." A young woman in business with a man of unknown background, it invites talk. Flynn had been standing nearby and now approached, his expression carefully neutral. "I understand your concerns," he said to the group. Perhaps a formal business agreement, drawn up by the town lawyer and witnessed by respected members of the community, would address these worries. Reverend Collins looked relieved at the suggestion. "That would certainly help, yes." "And of course," Flynn continued, "Miss Jameson and I will continue to maintain appropriate distance in our personal interactions." The implicit acknowledgement that their relationship had crossed into personal territory wasn't lost on Tabitha, who felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "Very well, Mrs. Whitaker conceded, though she still eyed Flynn with suspicion. "We'll expect to see this agreement by week's end." After the church delegation departed, Tabitha turned to Flynn with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "So now we need the church's blessing to rebuild a saloon." The irony is considerable. Flynn's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Frontier towns run on contradictions. The same people who'll drink whiskey Saturday night will condemn it from the pews Sunday morning." "And what about us?" she asked more quietly. "Was that just a diplomatic solution, or do you really intend to formalize our partnership?" "Both," he admitted. "It makes practical sense, protects your standing in the community, and clarifies our business arrangement. But Tabitha—" he glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "It doesn't change what happened last night, or what I feel." The sincerity in his eyes made her heart beat faster. "And what do you feel, Flynn Valero?" Before he could answer, a commotion near the lumber pile drew their attention. Two of Reynolds's men had ridden up and appeared to be arguing with McCready. "Trouble," Flynn muttered, striding quickly toward the confrontation with Tabitha close behind. "Need to inspect the lumber," one of the men was saying. "New territorial regulation requires all building materials to be certified safe." McCready's expression made it clear he wasn't buying the story. "Been shipping lumber through Wyoming territory for 8 years. Never heard of such a regulation." "It's new," the second man insisted. "Sheriff can confirm it." "I'm sure he can," Flynn said as he joined them, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Especially if Reynolds told him to. But unless you've got written documentation of this regulation, I suggest you move along." The first man, Brock, the suspected arsonist, turned to face Flynn, his hand hovering near his holster. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you Reynolds's errand boy," Flynn replied, his stance relaxed but alert. "And I'm telling you to get off this property." The tension crackled between them, Brock clearly itching for an excuse to draw his weapon. Tabitha stepped forward, placing herself deliberately in the line of sight. "Gentlemen, this is becoming tiresome," she said with forced calm. "If there's a new regulation, have Sheriff Mills bring the paperwork himself. Until then, we have work to continue." Her presence complicated matters for Brock, who clearly hadn't been instructed to cause trouble with the lady present. After a tense moment, he jerked his head at his companion. "We'll be back, with the sheriff and the paperwork." As they rode away, McCready spat on the ground. "Vultures, they'll try anything to slow us down." "They're getting desperate," Flynn observed, "which makes them more dangerous." That evening, Flynn and Tabitha met with Mr. Chambers, the town lawyer, to draft their business agreement. The elderly attorney had known Tabitha's father and seemed genuinely pleased to assist them. "A formal partnership protects you both," he explained as he wrote out the terms. "Miss Jameson retains ownership of the land and building, while Mr. Valero receives a 25% interest in the business for his investment of labor and materials." Flynn had insisted on the smaller percentage, despite Tabitha's arguments that his contribution warranted equal partnership. "The frontier is your legacy," he had told her privately. "I'm here to help, not take over." As they finalized the agreement, Chambers offered an additional suggestion. "You might consider forming a proper company. It would provide further legal protection, especially given the challenging circumstances." "Challenging circumstances," Tabitha repeated with a wry smile. "A diplomatic way of referring to Daniel Reynolds's attempts to destroy us." The lawyer adjusted his spectacles nervously. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Flynn assured him, "but your suggestion is sound. What would incorporation involve?" As Chambers explained the process, a plan began to form in Flynn's mind, a way to not only protect the frontier, but potentially turn the tables on Reynolds entirely. Later, as they walked back to the boarding house, Flynn shared his thoughts. "What if we expanded beyond just rebuilding the saloon? What if we created something bigger, something the town needs desperately?" Tabitha looked at him curiously. "What did you have in mind?" "A proper company, Frontier Enterprises. The saloon would be just the beginning. We could add a small hotel, as you suggested, but also a proper restaurant, maybe even a general store eventually." "That would require significantly more capital than we have," Tabitha pointed out. Flynn nodded. "True, but what if we offered shares to townsfolk? Small investments that would give them a stake in our success and a reason to stand against Reynolds." Tabitha stopped walking, considering the idea. "Community ownership. It's brilliant, Flynn. Reynolds controls through fear because he's the only economic power in town. If enough people have a financial interest in an alternative." "Exactly." Flynn's excitement was evident. "We spread the risk, build broader support, and create something too valuable for Reynolds to easily destroy." "It could work," she agreed, her mind racing with possibilities. "Though Reynolds will fight it with everything he has." "Let him," Flynn said with quiet determination. "The more he fights, the more he reveals himself as the tyrant he is." The next day, they presented their incorporation plan to Chambers, who agreed to draw up the necessary paperwork. Word spread quickly through town about the opportunity to invest in Frontier Enterprises. And to their surprise, several prominent citizens expressed interest, despite Reynolds's influence. "People are tired of one man controlling everything," Mr. Franklin explained when he visited them privately to discuss investing. "The bank board is loyal to Reynolds because he holds the majority of deposits, but many of us would welcome competition." Construction continued at a steady pace. with the basic structure of the new building taking shape. They had modified the design to accommodate future expansion, while focusing on completing the saloon portion first to begin generating revenue. As they worked side by side, Flynn found himself increasingly drawn to Tabitha, not just her beauty, which was considerable, but her intelligence, determination, and compassion. In the evenings, they would often find a few private moments to talk, or occasionally share a discreet kiss, their relationship deepening despite the need for public circumspection. One evening, as they reviewed plans in the partially constructed building, Flynn found himself watching Tabitha as she traced the design with her finger, explaining modifications to the bar area. "You're staring," she noted without looking up, though a smile played at her lips. "I'm admiring," he corrected. "There's a difference." Tabitha glanced up, her expression softening. Flynn. Whatever she intended to say was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Flynn moved to the window, his hand instinctively checking that his revolver was accessible. "Reynolds?" Tabitha asked, joining him. Flynn shook his head. "Sheriff Mills alone." They met the sheriff at the front of the building where the porch was beginning to take shape. Mills looked troubled as he dismounted, his usually neat appearance disheveled. "Evening," he greeted them grimly. "Afraid I've got bad news." "What now?" Tabitha asked, bracing herself. "Judge Peterson arrived from Cheyenne today," Mills explained. "Reynolds has filed for an injunction to stop construction, claims you're rebuilding without proper permits and in violation of town ordinances." Flynn's jaw tightened. "What ordinances? We've followed every regulation." "Newly passed ones, apparently," Mills said with obvious discomfort. "Town council held a special session yesterday very quietly. Approved new building codes that require structures on Main Street to be set back further from the road." "Our building is already framed," Tabitha protested. "We can't possibly move it back now." The sheriff looked genuinely regretful. "Judge will hear the case tomorrow morning. You'll need to be there, both of you." After Mills departed, Flynn paced the unfinished floor, his frustration evident. He's manipulating the legal system now, changing rules after we've started playing the game. "Can he do that?" Tabitha asked. "Create new ordinances specifically to target us?" "Legally, probably not, but with a compliant town council and a judge who might owe him favors." Flynn ran a hand through his hair. "We need to be prepared for the worst." That night, neither of them slept well. By morning, word had spread throughout Sheridan about the hearing, and when they arrived at the courthouse, they found it crowded with spectators. Judge Peterson was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with piercing gray eyes and a reputation for strict interpretation of the law. He called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. Reynolds's lawyer presented their case first, citing the newly enacted ordinances and arguing that the Frontier's reconstruction violated multiple provisions. The man was skilled, presenting the case as a matter of public safety rather than personal vendetta. When it was their turn, Chambers rose to speak on their behalf. The elderly lawyer might have seemed outmatched, but as he began to address the court, his voice grew stronger, his arguments precise. "Your Honor, the ordinance in question was passed after construction had already begun, with all previously required permits properly obtained," he stated. "The selective application of this ordinance to a single business constitutes discriminatory enforcement and an unreasonable taking of property without due process." The judge frowned. "Are you suggesting impropriety in the town council's actions, Mr. Chambers?" "I am suggesting, Your Honor, that the timing and targeted nature of this ordinance raises serious questions about its intent," Chambers replied. "Furthermore, I would direct the court's attention to this." He presented documents showing that none of Reynolds's own buildings complied with the new setback requirements, yet no enforcement action had been proposed against them. As the arguments continued, Flynn noticed something unexpected. The courtroom audience was clearly sympathetic to their side. Whispers and nods followed Chambers's points, while Reynolds's lawyer received stony silence. After both sides had presented their cases, Judge Peterson called a brief recess to consider his ruling. Flynn and Tabitha waited anxiously in an antechamber, joined by McCready and several other supporters. "Whatever happens," Flynn assured her, "we'll find a way forward." Tabitha squeezed his hand. "I know, we've come too far to give up now." When court reconvened, Judge Peterson delivered his ruling with deliberate formality. Having reviewed the ordinance in question and the circumstances of its passage and enforcement, this court finds that its application to the Frontier Saloon's reconstruction constitutes an improper ex post facto restriction on previously approved development. He fixed Reynolds with a stern gaze. "The injunction is denied, and construction may continue as planned." A murmur of approval ran through the courtroom. Reynolds's face darkened with anger as he whispered furiously to his lawyer. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court finds troubling the apparent selective enforcement of this ordinance. I am therefore issuing an order requiring all Main Street buildings to comply with the new setback requirements within 6 months, including those owned by Mr. Reynolds and his various business interests." Flynn couldn't suppress a smile at the judge's clever solution. By applying the rule universally, he had not only allowed their construction to proceed, but had turned Reynolds's own tactic against him. As they left the courthouse, townspeople stopped them with congratulations and words of support. For the first time, Flynn allowed himself to believe they might actually succeed in establishing Frontier Enterprises as a viable alternative to Reynolds's control. Their victory celebration was cut short, however, by the arrival of a breathless McCready. "The construction site," he gasped. "Reynolds's men, they're tearing down the framing." They raced toward the partially built saloon, gathering supporters along the way. By the time they arrived, a crowd had formed, watching as Brock and half a dozen other men systematically dismantled the framework they had spent weeks erecting. "Stop," Tabitha called out, pushing through the onlookers. "You have no right," Brock turned, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "We have every right. Judge said this building needs to be set back from the street. We're just helping you comply." Flynn stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "The judge gave existing buildings 6 months to comply. Our permits are valid and you're destroying private property." "Looks like an accident to me," Brock replied, signaling his men to continue. "Construction sites are dangerous places." Sheriff Mills pushed through the crowd, looking alarmed. "That's enough. Stop this immediately." To everyone's surprise, Reynolds himself appeared, riding up on his expensive black stallion. "What seems to be the problem, Sheriff?" he asked with feigned innocence. "Your men are destroying our property," Tabitha accused. "After we won in court." Reynolds affected a concerned expression. "My men? I don't see any of my employees here, just concerned citizens helping enforce the new ordinance." The standoff intensified as more townspeople gathered, many clearly outraged by the blatant destruction. Flynn noted with satisfaction that public sentiment was solidly against Reynolds, even if most were too intimidated to intervene directly. Sheriff Mills finally drew his pistol. "I don't care who they work for. Anyone who doesn't put down those tools and step away from the building will be arrested for vandalism and destruction of property." Brock hesitated, looking to Reynolds for guidance. The cattle baron's expression hardened as he assessed the crowd's mood. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Reynolds finally said. "If these men are causing trouble, they should certainly desist." He fixed Brock with a meaningful look. Immediately. Reluctantly, Brock and his companions dropped their tools and backed away from the damaged framework. "This isn't over," Brock muttered as he passed Flynn. "Not by a long shot." "I know," Flynn replied calmly, "but your boss is starting to realize he's fighting the whole town now, not just us." As the crowd dispersed, Flynn, Tabitha, and McCready surveyed the damage. Several key support beams had been compromised, and much of the front wall would need to be rebuilt. "Could have been worse," McCready assessed pragmatically. "We can fix this in a couple of days." Tabitha looked up at Flynn, her expression determined despite the setback. "He's getting desperate." "That's a good sign, isn't it?" Flynn nodded, slipping his arm around her waist when he was sure no one was watching. "It is, but it also makes him more dangerous. We need to be prepared for anything." That night, as a precaution, they arranged for men to take shifts watching the construction site. Flynn took the first watch himself, settling into a chair on the unfinished porch with his rifle across his knees. Around midnight, Tabitha appeared with a thermos of coffee and a blanket against the mountain chill. "You should be sleeping," he chided gently as she sat beside him. "So should you," she countered. "But since neither of us seems capable of it, we might as well keep watch together." They sat in comfortable silence, the town quiet around them except for occasional laughter from the Western Star Hotel down the street. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't ridden into Sheridan that day?" Tabitha asked softly. "If you hadn't seen the fire," Flynn considered the question. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens. Leads to nothing but regret." "Not always," she disagreed. "Sometimes it leads to gratitude." She turned to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "I'm grateful, Flynn, not just for the rescue or the help rebuilding, but for everything since." The emotion in her voice touched something deep within him. "Tabitha." He reached out to trace the curve of her cheek. "I rode into Sheridan looking for nothing more than a night's rest before moving on. I never expected to find a home." The word hung between them, weighted with significance. Flynn hadn't called anywhere home since leaving Texas nearly 15 years earlier. "Is that what this is becoming?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A home," Flynn nodded slowly, "if you want it to be." Instead of answering with words, Tabitha leaned forward and kissed him, a kiss that conveyed everything they'd been hesitant to express openly: hope, desire, and a deepening affection that was rapidly becoming something more profound. When they finally parted, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "When this is all over, when the frontier is rebuilt and Reynolds is no longer a threat, I want to do this properly. Court you the way you deserve, not hiding in shadows." Tabitha smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd like that very much." The next few days brought a flurry of activity as they repaired the damaged framework and continued construction at an accelerated pace. Support from the town grew more visible as people recognized the battle for what it was: not just a business dispute, but a fight for the community's future. Investors came forward to purchase shares in Frontier Enterprises, providing much-needed capital for the expanded plans. Women brought food for the workers. Men volunteered their labor during off hours. Children ran errands, carrying messages and tools. Reynolds, meanwhile, appeared to have temporarily retreated. His men maintained a watchful presence around town but made no further moves against the construction. "He's regrouping," Flynn warned Tabitha as they reviewed progress one afternoon, "planning something bigger. Or perhaps he's recognized that public opinion has turned against him," she suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't really believe it. Flynn shook his head. "Men like Reynolds don't surrender power willingly. They fight to the bitter end, especially when their pride is involved. His prediction proved accurate 3 days later when a telegram arrived from the territorial capital. "They're claiming our incorporation papers are invalid," Chambers explained gravely after reading the message. "Someone has filed a formal complaint alleging fraud in our share offerings." "Reynolds," Flynn guessed, taking the fight to a higher authority where his influence might carry more weight. Chambers nodded soberly. "The Territorial Business Commissioner wants to see all our documentation and interview the principal shareholders. We have 1 week to comply or they'll issue a cease and desist order." 1 week, Tabitha repeated, calculating. "That's not enough time to finish construction." "But it might be enough to open the saloon portion," Flynn pointed out. "If we're operating as a legitimate business when the commissioner arrives, our position will be stronger." McCready, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. "We can do it. Focus all efforts on the main room and bar, leave the rest for later. Get those doors open." The decision made, they redoubled their efforts, working from dawn until well after dusk each day. Flynn personally supervised the installation of the bar, a magnificent piece crafted from polished pine with brass rails and intricate carvings. Tabitha, meanwhile, secured liquor supplies, glassware, and furnishings. She hired staff, a bartender from Denver, 2 waitresses from the Western Star who were eager for better treatment, and a piano player who had recently arrived on the eastbound train. 5 days later, though the upper floor remained unfinished and parts of the building were still under construction, the main saloon was ready for business. The night before their planned opening, Tabitha stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. "It's better than before," she said softly. "Father would be proud." Flynn watched her from the doorway, struck once again by her strength and resilience. "He raised an extraordinary daughter." She smiled at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We did this, Flynn, despite everything Reynolds threw at us. We're not finished yet," he cautioned, crossing the room to join her. "Opening tomorrow is just the beginning." "I know." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally now, "but it's an important beginning." The Frontier's grand reopening was scheduled for noon the following day. By 11, a crowd had already gathered outside, curious to see the reborn establishment. Reynolds and his men were conspicuously absent, which only heightened Flynn's anxiety. "Too quiet," he murmured to McCready as they made final preparations. "He's planning something." The Irishman nodded grimly. "My boys are keeping watch. No one gets close without us knowing." At precisely noon, Tabitha unlocked the front doors, dressed in an elegant green dress that complemented her chestnut hair. Flynn stood beside her, freshly shaved and wearing a new black suit that they'd decided was appropriate for a business partner's public appearance. "Welcome to the new frontier," Tabitha called out as the doors swung open. "First drink is on the house." The crowd surged forward eagerly, filling the saloon within minutes. The piano player struck up a lively tune, and the atmosphere quickly became festive. Many patrons made a point of congratulating Tabitha and Flynn, some overtly mentioning their pleasure at seeing Reynolds's plans thwarted. By mid-afternoon, the opening was clearly a success. The bar was doing brisk business, and several potential investors had approached them about purchasing shares in the enterprise. Flynn had just finished speaking with Mr. Franklin about expanding their banking relationship when Sheriff Mills entered, looking grave. He made his way directly to Flynn, leaning in to speak privately. "Reynolds is on the move," he said quietly. "Just got word he's bringing in a dozen hired guns from Cheyenne, due on tomorrow's train." Flynn's jaw tightened. "Escalating to violence. I was afraid it might come to this." "There's more," Mills continued. Territorial Commissioner arrived early. He's meeting with Reynolds right now. Word is the paperwork Reynolds filed paints you as swindlers, taking money from innocent townsfolk for a fraudulent enterprise. Tabitha had joined them in time to hear this last part. That's absurd. Our investors know exactly what they're purchasing. Doesn't matter if it's true, Flynn pointed out. Just matters what the commissioner believes long enough to shut us down. Mills looked uncomfortable. I should warn you, if Reynolds convinces the commissioner to act, I'll be obligated to enforce whatever orders are issued. We understand, Sheriff, Tabitha assured him. You have your duty. After Mills departed, Flynn and Tabitha retreated to the small office behind the bar to discuss their options. If Reynolds is bringing in gunmen, he's planning something violent, Flynn said, pacing the small space. We need to be prepared. Tabitha sat at the desk, her expression troubled. Violence won't solve this, Flynn. If shots are fired, even in self-defense, we'll be painted as the troublemakers. What do you suggest, then? She considered for a moment. We need to meet with the commissioner ourselves, present our case directly. Show him our legitimate business, our proper documentation. Reynolds will have poisoned him against us already, Flynn pointed out. Perhaps, but we have something Reynolds doesn't: the truth and the support of the townspeople. Flynn had to admire her unwavering faith in justice and human decency, even as his own experience suggested a more cynical outlook. All right, we'll try it your way first. They sent word to the commissioner requesting a meeting the following morning, then returned to oversee the saloon's continued operation. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with more patrons arriving as word spread of the successful opening. As the last customers were departing around midnight, Flynn noticed a familiar figure slipping through the door: Brock, Reynolds's right-hand man. The scarred cowboy made no threatening moves, instead walking directly to the bar and ordering a whiskey. Flynn approached cautiously, positioning himself within reach of the shotgun kept under the counter. Didn't expect to see you here, Brock. The man shrugged, downing his drink in one swallow. Free country. Heard you pour a decent whiskey. We do, Flynn agreed, maintaining a watchful distance. Though I'm surprised Reynolds allows his men to patronize the competition. A strange expression crossed Brock's weathered face. Reynolds doesn't own me. Could have fooled me, Flynn replied evenly. Setting fires, destroying property seems like the work of a man following orders. Brock's eyes narrowed. You don't know what you're talking about. I know Reynolds is bringing in gunmen tomorrow, Flynn said bluntly, planning to escalate from property damage to something worse. To Flynn's surprise, Brock didn't deny it. Not my idea, he muttered, pushing his glass forward for a refill. Told him it was a mistake. Flynn poured another measure, studying the man carefully. Why are you really here, Brock? The cowboy downed his second drink before answering. To give you advice: get out while you can. Take the girl and ride. Reynolds won't stop until he gets what he wants, and he doesn't care who gets hurt. I don't run from bullies, Flynn said quietly. Neither does Miss Jameson. Then you're both fools, Brock replied, though there was something like respect in his tone. Brave fools, but fools nonetheless. After Brock departed, Flynn related the strange conversation to Tabitha as they closed up for the night. McCready and two of his men had volunteered to stand watch, allowing Flynn and Tabitha to return to the boarding house for much-needed rest. Why would he warn us? Tabitha wondered as they walked through the quiet streets. Maybe he has more conscience than we gave him credit for, Flynn suggested. Or maybe it's a trick to frighten us into leaving. Either way, it confirms Reynolds is planning something drastic. Flynn nodded grimly. Which means tomorrow will be decisive, one way or another. At the boarding house, they paused in the hallway between their rooms, the events of the day and the uncertainty of tomorrow hanging heavily between them. "Whatever happens," Flynn said softly, taking her hands in his, "I want you to know these past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life." Tabitha smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the dim hallway light. "For me as well." He bent to kiss her goodnight, a gentle touch that conveyed all the emotions they had yet to fully express. As he turned to go, she caught his arm. "Flynn," she whispered, "stay with me tonight." The request, so simply stated yet so profound in its implications, caught him by surprise. "Tabitha, your reputation, I don't care about gossip," she interrupted. "Tomorrow is uncertain and tonight I don't want to be alone." Flynn looked into her eyes and saw no doubt there, only certainty and a depth of feeling that matched his own. Wordlessly, he followed her into her room, closing the door softly behind them. Their lovemaking was tender yet passionate, a physical expression of the connection that had grown between them since that first fateful day. Afterward, lying together in the narrow bed, Flynn held Tabitha close, savoring the perfect rightness of her in his arms. "I love you," he whispered into her hair, the words he'd held back finally finding voice in the quiet darkness. "Whatever happens tomorrow or the days after, that won't change." Tabitha raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, her hair falling like a curtain around them. "I love you too, Flynn Valero. You rode into my life when I needed you most, and I can no longer imagine it without you." They fell asleep entwined, finding peace in each other's arms despite the looming confrontation. Morning came too quickly. They rose early, dressing with a quiet intimacy that felt both new and somehow familiar. By unspoken agreement, they left the boarding house separately to avoid feeding the town's gossip mill Flynn first, then Tabitha, 10 minutes later. The commissioner had agreed to meet them at 9 o'clock at the sheriff's office. As they approached the building, Flynn noted several unfamiliar men loitering nearby, hard-eyed strangers with the unmistakable bearing of hired guns. "Reynolds's reinforcements arrived early," he murmured to Tabitha, who nodded slightly to indicate she'd noticed them too. Sheriff Mills met them at the door, his expression troubled. "Commissioner Wilson is inside. Reynolds is with him." "Of course he is," Flynn said grimly. "Let's get this over with." The territorial commissioner proved to be a small, precise man with spectacles and an air of bureaucratic authority. He looked up from the papers spread before him as they entered, his expression neutral. "Miss Jameson, Mr. Valero," he greeted them. "I understand you wish to speak with me regarding your business enterprise." "We do," Tabitha confirmed, moving forward confidently despite Reynolds's glowering presence in the corner. "We understand there have been allegations made regarding our incorporation and share offerings." "Serious allegations," Reynolds interjected. "Fraud, misrepresentation, operating without proper authority." Commissioner Wilson held up a hand. "Mr. Reynolds, please. I've heard your concerns. Now I'd like to hear from Miss Jameson and Mr. Valero." Tabitha presented their case methodically, producing documentation for every aspect of their business: the partnership agreement, incorporation papers, share certificates, and building permits. Flynn added details about their construction progress and plans for future expansion. As they spoke, Flynn watched the commissioner carefully, noting how the man's initial skepticism seemed to waver in the face of their thorough preparation and evident sincerity. "And you have the support of local investors?" Wilson asked, examining the list of shareholders they had provided. "We do," Tabitha confirmed. "Many prominent citizens of Sheridan have purchased shares, including Mr. Franklin of the bank and Reverend Collins." "Collins," Reynolds interrupted incredulously. "The preacher invested in a saloon in Frontier Enterprises," Tabitha corrected smoothly. Our plans extend beyond the saloon to include a hotel, restaurant, and eventually other businesses that will benefit the entire community. Wilson studied the documents thoughtfully. Everything appears to be in order, despite Mr. Reynolds's concerns. Your paperwork is complete, your permits valid, and your share offerings appropriately documented. Reynolds stepped forward, his face flushing with anger. This is absurd. They're swindlers, using fancy papers to steal good people's money. You have evidence of actual fraud, Mr. Reynolds. Wilson asked calmly. Not suspicions or accusations, but proof. The cattle baron's silence was answer enough. As I thought, Wilson concluded, gathering the papers and returning them to Tabitha. Based on my review, I find no basis for intervention by the Territorial Business Authority. Frontier Enterprises appears to be a legitimate business venture, properly incorporated and licensed. The relief that washed over Tabitha was visible, though she maintained her composed demeanor. Flynn allowed himself a small smile, more at Reynolds's obvious fury than at their victory. "This isn't over," Reynolds snarled as he stormed toward the door. Not by a long shot. After he departed, Commissioner Wilson adjusted his spectacles with a sigh. An unpleasant man. I must confess, his aggressive manner did more to undermine his case than support it. "Thank you for your fairness," Tabitha said sincerely. "We've worked hard to ensure everything is done properly, despite considerable obstacles." Wilson nodded, understanding. "I've heard rumors about the difficulties you faced." Such tactics are unfortunately common in rapidly developing territories where law and order are still being established. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Mills pulled Flynn aside. "Reynolds's men are spread throughout town. I'd be careful if I were you." "We'll be watchful," Flynn assured him. "But I don't think he'll try anything in broad daylight, not after losing face with the commissioner." They returned to the frontier to prepare for opening at noon. The staff arrived, and McCready reported that construction on the upper floor could resume now that their legal status was secured. By the time they opened the doors, a sizable crowd had gathered again, many having heard about the commissioner's ruling. The atmosphere was celebratory, with patrons explicitly congratulating them on standing up to Reynolds. As the afternoon progressed, Flynn maintained a vigilant watch, noting the presence of several of Reynolds's newly arrived gunmen among the customers. They behaved themselves, however, merely observing while nursing their drinks. "They're just watching," Tabitha noted as she joined Flynn behind the bar. "Taking our measure. For now," he agreed. "The real test will come after dark, I'm thinking." His prediction proved accurate. As evening fell, Reynolds himself entered the frontier, flanked by Brock and two other men. The saloon fell momentarily silent at his appearance before conversation resumed at a more subdued level. Reynolds approached the bar, where Flynn stood waiting. Tabitha moved to join them, her expression composed but watchful. "Quite the establishment you've built," Reynolds remarked, his tone falsely cordial. "Rising from the ashes, as they say." "Thank you," Tabitha replied coolly. "We're rather proud of it, as you should be." Reynolds's gaze swept the room. So many supporters. So many investors with their hard-earned money tied up in this venture. Flynn recognized the threat implicit in his words. "Is there something specific you wanted, Reynolds? Or did you just come to sample our whiskey?" The cattle baron smiled thinly. "One last opportunity, actually. I'm a businessman, after all. I'm prepared to make a final offer twice what the property was worth before the fire, enough for you both to start fresh elsewhere, and for your investors to receive a handsome return." "Not interested," Tabitha said firmly. "As I've told you repeatedly." Reynolds leaned closer, dropping the pretense of civility. "You should reconsider. It would be a shame if another accident befell your lovely establishment, especially with so many people inside." The threat hung in the air between them, unmistakable in its implication. Flynn felt his muscles tense, ready for whatever might come next. Before either of them could respond, an unexpected voice spoke up from behind Reynolds. "That's enough, Daniel." They all turned to see Judge Peterson standing there, his stern gaze fixed on Reynolds. "Judge," Reynolds acknowledged, visibly surprised by the man's presence. "This is a private business discussion. I just heard a threat of arson and potential harm to innocent citizens," Peterson replied evenly. "That makes it a matter of public concern." Reynolds composed his features quickly. "You misunderstood. I was merely expressing concern about the safety of such a hastily constructed building." "We both know that's not true," the judge said. He looked around the room, noting the attention they had attracted. "I suggest you leave now, Mr. Reynolds, before you say something that cannot be so easily explained away." For a moment, it seemed Reynolds might defy the judge. Then, with a tight nod, he gestured to his men. "Another time, perhaps," he said to Tabitha and Flynn before departing. After they left, Judge Peterson approached the bar. "I thought my presence might be useful tonight," he explained. "Commissioner Wilson mentioned his concerns about potential retaliation after his ruling." "We appreciate it," Flynn said sincerely, pouring a whiskey and sliding it toward the judge. "Though I doubt this is the end of it." Peterson sipped his drink appreciatively. "Likely not. Men like Reynolds don't surrender power easily." He regarded them thoughtfully. "You've accomplished something remarkable here, not just rebuilding, but rallying the town against his influence." "The town was ready for change," Tabitha observed. "They just needed someone to take the first step." The judge raised his glass in a small toast. "To first steps, then, and the courage to take them." The evening continued without further incident, though Flynn remained alert, aware that Reynolds's retreat might be temporary. When they closed for the night, Judge Peterson insisted on escorting them back to the boarding house, an offer they gratefully accepted. As they prepared to part ways in the hallway, mindful of maintaining appearances despite the intimacy they had shared the previous night, Flynn squeezed Tabitha's hand gently. "Lock your door," he murmured. "I'll be next door if you need anything." She nodded, though her eyes conveyed how difficult their separation would be after having found such comfort in each other's arms. "Good night, Flynn." Flynn retired to his room but did not undress, instead sitting near the window that overlooked the street, his revolver close at hand. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and everything within him suggested that Reynolds was not finished. His vigilance was rewarded shortly after midnight, when he spotted movement in the shadows across from the boarding house. Men gathering, at least 6 of them, moving with purpose toward the building. Flynn was out his door in an instant, knocking urgently on Tabitha's room before continuing down the hall to alert McCready and his men, who were also staying at the boarding house. Tabitha emerged, wrapped in a dressing gown, her expression questioning until she saw Flynn's grim face and the gun in his hand. "Reynolds's men," he explained quickly. "Approaching the building. Get dressed quickly." She disappeared back into her room without argument while Flynn roused the others. By the time Tabitha rejoined them, fully dressed, McCready and 3 of his crew were armed and ready. "What's the plan?" McCready asked as they gathered in the hallway. "They're likely here for us, not the other boarders," Flynn reasoned. "We need to draw them away from the house." "The saloon," Tabitha suggested. "If they follow us there, at least the confrontation will be away from innocent people." Flynn nodded agreement. "McCready, you and your men go first, create a diversion. Tabitha and I will slip out the back way." They moved quickly, McCready and his men exiting the front door with deliberate noise while Flynn and Tabitha used the kitchen entrance at the rear of the building. In the darkness, Flynn could make out figures moving toward the boarding house, their attention momentarily fixed on McCready's group. "Now," he whispered, guiding Tabitha across the yard and into the alley that would lead them toward the saloon. They had covered half the distance when a shout indicated they had been spotted. Flynn urged Tabitha forward as running footsteps sounded behind them. "Almost there," he encouraged as the frontier's outline appeared ahead. They reached the back door, Flynn fumbling with the key as two of Reynolds's men rounded the corner of the building. He managed to unlock the door just as a bullet splintered the wood beside his head. "Inside," he ordered, pushing Tabitha through the door before turning to fire a return shot, forcing their pursuers to take cover. Once inside, Flynn barred the door and led Tabitha quickly through the darkened building to the main room. The front windows provided enough moonlight to navigate by as they took positions behind the solid oak bar. "There's a shotgun under the counter," Tabitha reminded him, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. Flynn retrieved it, checking that it was loaded. "They'll try to surround the building. We need to be ready." As if on cue, the sound of breaking glass came from the back room, someone forcing entry through a window. Flynn moved to intercept, firing a warning shot that sent the intruder scrambling back outside. "Flynn," Tabitha called urgently. The front door. He turned to see the main entrance shuddering under heavy impact, someone trying to break it down. The solid construction was holding, but it wouldn't last forever under such assault. "We need help," Tabitha said, stating the obvious. "Sheriff Mills, probably being kept busy elsewhere," Flynn finished grimly. Reynolds would have thought of that. A crash from upstairs indicated someone had found access through the unfinished second floor. They were being surrounded, just as Flynn had feared. "Stay behind me," he instructed, positioning himself to cover both the stairs and the increasingly damaged front door. The situation was deteriorating rapidly when a new sound cut through the night, a shotgun blast, followed by shouts of alarm from outside. Then another shot, and another. "McCready," Flynn realized with relief. He and his men must have followed us. The assault on the building paused as Reynolds's men dealt with the new threat. Flynn used the moment to move to a window, peering cautiously outside. In the street, he could see McCready and his crew engaged in a firefight with several of the attackers. "We need to help them," he decided, turning back to Tabitha. "If we can get to the roof through the unfinished section, we'd have the high ground." She nodded understanding, following him toward the stairs. They had just reached the second floor when Flynn heard footsteps above someone already on the roof. "Back," he whispered, pulling Tabitha into the shadows as a figure descended the makeshift ladder that led to the roof access. Flynn waited until the man was fully in view before stepping forward, shotgun leveled. "That's far enough." The intruder froze, then slowly raised his hands. In the dim light filtering through the unfinished walls, Flynn recognized Brock. "Should have known you'd be leading this," Flynn said coldly. To his surprise, Brock shook his head. "Not leading it, trying to stop it." "Why would you do that?" Tabitha asked skeptically. "Because this has gone too far," Brock replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Reynolds is out of control. He ordered us to burn the place down again with you inside." Flynn kept the shotgun steady. "And you suddenly developed a conscience." "I never wanted anyone killed," Brock insisted. "Property damage, intimidation, that's one thing. Murder is another." Before Flynn could respond, gunfire erupted outside again, more intense than before. Through the unfinished wall they could see muzzle flashes in the street below. "Your men are still attacking our friends," Flynn pointed out. "Not my men anymore," Brock said. I told Reynolds I was done. That's why I came ahead to warn you. Flynn and Tabitha exchanged a quick glance, a silent communication passing between them. Despite everything, there was a ring of truth to Brock's words. If you're really here to help, Flynn said finally, prove it. Help us stop this before anyone gets killed. Brock nodded grimly. Reynolds is watching from across the street, directing everything from the alley beside the hotel. He's got 4 men with him if we can reach him. We can end this, Flynn finished. He made a quick decision. All right, you go first. Any tricks and I won't hesitate to shoot. With Brock leading, they moved carefully through the unfinished upper floor to a point where they could access the adjoining building's roof. From there, they worked their way along the rooftops until they had a view of the alley Brock had indicated. Sure enough, Reynolds stood there with several men, gesturing as he issued commands. They were focused on the confrontation in the street, unaware of the 3 figures approaching from above. Flynn assessed their options quickly. There's a fire escape on the hotel side. We can use it to get down behind them. The descent was perilous in the darkness, but they managed it without detection. As they reached the ground, Flynn handed Tabitha his revolver. Stay back, he instructed. If anything goes wrong, run for the sheriff's office. She took the gun but shook her head firmly. We do this together. Flynn knew better than to argue. With a nod to Brock, they moved forward, emerging into the alley with weapons raised. That's enough, Reynolds, Flynn called out. Call off your men. Reynolds spun around, his face contorting with rage at the sight of Brock alongside them. Traitor, he spat. It's over, Flynn continued steadily. Your men are outmatched and now you're cornered. End this before someone dies. For a moment, it seemed Reynolds might surrender. Then, with startling speed, he drew a concealed derringer, aiming not at Flynn but at Tabitha. Drop your weapons, he demanded, or I'll kill her where she stands. Flynn froze, acutely aware that neither he nor Brock could fire without risking Reynolds getting off his shot. Tabitha stood perfectly still, the revolver Flynn had given her half raised. You won't get away with murder in the middle of town, she said calmly. Even you aren't above the law. Reynolds's laugh was bitter. The law? I am the law in Sheridan, have been for years. His gaze shifted between them. Now drop your weapons. Final warning. The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, a new voice broke the tension. I believe the lady asked you to stand down, Reynolds. Sheriff Mills stood at the entrance to the alley, his rifle aimed squarely at the cattle baron. Behind him were several townspeople, including Judge Peterson and Mr. Franklin from the bank. Reinforcements arrived, Mills explained with a slight smile. Seems your men weren't as discreet as you'd hoped. Woke up half the town with their gunfire. Reynolds looked around wildly, realizing he was now completely surrounded. His men in the alley, seeing the situation deteriorating, began to back away, clearly unwilling to die for their employer. This isn't over, Reynolds threatened, though his voice had lost its conviction. Actually, it is, Judge Peterson stated, stepping forward. Daniel Reynolds, you're under arrest for attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, and a host of other charges I'll enumerate more fully once you're safely in jail. Reynolds's face contorted with rage. For a moment, it seemed he might still fire at Tabitha out of pure spite. Then, seeing no escape, he slowly lowered the derringer. You're making a mistake, he said as Mills moved to take him into custody. This town needs me. The businesses, the jobs, we'll manage, Mr. Franklin interrupted coolly. Starting with a more equitable distribution of the bank's loans and services. As Reynolds was led away, the tension drained from the alley. Flynn immediately went to Tabitha, pulling her into a tight embrace regardless of who might be watching. Are you all right? He murmured against her hair. I am now, she assured him, her arms wrapping around his waist. Is it really over? Reynolds's reign is, Flynn confirmed. The rest is just beginning. In the days that followed, the true extent of Reynolds's corruption came to light. Investigations revealed years of intimidation, bribery, and manipulation that had allowed him to control everything from land prices to water rights throughout the region. Many of his men, including Brock, turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. The hired gunmen from Cheyenne, finding themselves without an employer or payment, quickly departed town. The frontier was completed on schedule, including the expanded hotel section Tabitha had envisioned. On opening night, the entire town seemed to turn out to celebrate not just the saloon's resurrection, but their own liberation from Reynolds's shadow. As the evening wound down, Flynn found Tabitha on the new upper balcony, looking out over the town that had fought for and won its independence. "Quite a view," he remarked, joining her at the railing. "Quite a town," she replied, leaning against him as his arm encircled her waist. "I never imagined when I returned to Sheridan that I'd end up at the center of a revolution." Flynn chuckled. "A small revolution, perhaps, but an important one." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as townspeople made their way home through the lamp-lit streets. "I received a telegram today," Flynn said finally, "from the ranch near Billings. They're still interested in hiring me as foreman." Tabitha tensed slightly in his arms. "I see, and are you considering it?" Flynn turned her gently to face him, his expression serious. "I telegraphed back to decline the position. My future is here now if you'll have me." The relief that washed over her face was swiftly replaced by joy. "If I'll have you, Flynn Valero, I think I made my feelings quite clear that night at the boarding house." "You did," he acknowledged with a smile, "but I'm talking about something more permanent." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I'm talking about this." Tabitha's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "I'm not a wealthy man," Flynn said softly, "but I love you, Tabitha Jameson. I love your courage, your determination, your compassion. I want to build a life with you here in Sheridan, continuing what we've started together." Tears filled Tabitha's eyes as she looked from the ring to Flynn's face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Flynn Valero." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Flynn felt a sense of homecoming more profound than any he'd experienced since leaving Texas all those years ago. He had ridden into Sheridan a drifter, a man without purpose or connection. He would remain as a partner, a husband, a pillar of the community they had helped to transform. "When I saw the flames licking at your dress that day," he murmured as he drew her close, "I never imagined where it would lead us." Tabitha smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the same wonder and gratitude he felt. "From fire to freedom," she said. "Not a bad journey, all things considered." Their wedding 3 months later was the social event of the season in Sheridan. The ceremony, performed by Reverend Collins in the newly built church, was attended by nearly everyone in town. McCready served as Flynn's best man, having delayed his return to Montana to participate in the celebration. Afterward, the reception at the frontier lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and more than a few emotional toasts to the couple who had helped free the town from Reynolds's grip. As the years passed, frontier enterprises grew and prospered under their joint leadership. They expanded beyond Sheridan, establishing businesses in neighboring towns and eventually throughout the territory. Their commitment to fair practices and community investment earned them the respect and loyalty that Reynolds had tried to command through fear. 5 years after their wedding, as they stood on the porch of their home overlooking Sheridan now, a thriving town of over 2,000 souls. Tabitha leaned against Flynn's shoulder, their 3-year-old son Thomas asleep in his arms, and their infant daughter Emily cradled in hers. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked softly. "When the saloon burned," Flynn nodded, his free arm tightening around her waist. "Often. It was the day everything changed, the day I stopped running and finally found my way home." Tabitha smiled up at him, the love in her eyes as bright as it had been that night on the balcony when he proposed. "Home," she repeated. "That's exactly what we've built, isn't it? Not just for ourselves, but for everyone here." As the setting sun bathed Sheridan in golden light, Flynn looked out over the town they had helped transform, the businesses, the school, the library they had recently funded. People walked the streets freely, commerce thrived, and children played without the shadow of a tyrant's influence. "We did good work here," he said simply. "And we're just getting started," Tabitha reminded him, her eyes sparkling with the same determination that had first captured his heart. Flynn Valero, once a drifter without direction, kissed his wife tenderly, surrounded by the family and community that had become his world. From the ashes of destruction, they had built something extraordinary, a legacy of courage, perseverance, and love that would endure long after the memory of flames licking at a dress had faded into legend.